Here we are today drinking tea with Hugh Padgham at Stanley House Studios. Um, so,
Well,
Hugh,
it's not really Stanley House
what is this
Studios.
studio called now? Tell us all about this.
Well, it's now called Sofa Sound.
Sofa Sound.
It was Stanley House Studios, and they decided they didn't want to run a commercial studio a few years ago now. Not quite sure
Mm.
when. There was a J series
Mm.
in here originally, and anyway, so the long and the short of it is that the person who owns the building still owns it, but they kind of rent out sort of
Mm.
empty rooms. So we've put all this gear in here
Right.
to make it into a studio, and we've called it Sofa Sound Studios.
As in the sofa at the back of the room.
Well, yeah, sofa as in the back of the room, but it also stands for state of the effing art,
Very good. I like
um,
that.
which
Yeah.
I mean, we're not running it as a commercial studio. Sure. I mean, I'm doing my stuff here, and I've been working with Jay Reynolds here for a few years now. And he has his things to do, and he's brilliant on the tools, which I can't do at all. So when I'm doing my stuff, he helps me,
Right.
and then when I'm not doing that, he does his own stuff and all that. So,
Okay.
you know,
So
but
what prompted the move here then? Where did you work previously? So,
well, we had a room at the Townhouse Studios, a room downstairs. It was originally a tape storage.
right.
In the old days, before they realised that they could get a bunch of money from chuck the tapes away and get some money. But we had a Control 24 in
Oh,
there,
right, yeah.
at a small overdub booth, but we really couldn't do more than overdub. We couldn't. Well, we could mix there in Pro Tools. We didn't have any proper analog. Although we have got, because I helped develop this Sumo mixer, which is a new Audient thing, which is an audio summing
Okay.
mixer. Because when we did have to mix in there, we realised that mixing straight in Pro Tools was not a great idea. But I've always wanted to have my own studio, because there's not that many good rooms around as far as I'm concerned, and to always have that pressure of knowing ahead that you've got to try and book the room and so on and so forth. So anyway, we made the plunge, discovered the room was available here, and so we've taken it, got this great 64 channel SSL in here, and huge amount of outboard gear, as you can see, that would probably embarrass some commercial studios. And here we are,
Fantastic.
Mm.
So, for someone like yourself who's been doing it a long time and had a lot of success, how do you remain current? How does a producer remain current?
Well, I think if you just stay where you are, you'll eventually it comes around. Well, I mean, I've been doing this last McFly record, which I suppose is current, but I mean, I was asked to do it by the A&R guy at the record company, because he wanted somebody to actually be able to record the band old style, i.e., four guys standing in a room, all playing together. And I think I don't know what is sort of current and what isn't. I mean, if you're talking about making albums with synthetic albums in a bedroom with drum machines and synthesizers and all that, I've never really done that anyway, and I wouldn't know really how to do that, and it's not really what I like doing. So to me, in a way, it's just doing things how I've always done them, but and also encompassing new technology, because
I was going to say,
because
presumably.
here you can see there's a Pro Tools setup. So I mean, the whole thing of recording in Pro Tools and the editing facilities and so on and so forth is absolutely amazing, but to me, things still sound better on analog.
Right.
So I try and amalgamate the two technologies. So we have a 24-track analog tape recorder here. What I like to do is record, if we're working with a band, we mic the band up, record it all to 24-track. Depending on whether you want to edit there and then or whatever, then we copy the the analog into the digital.
Okay.
And now we're running at 96K,
Mm-hmm.
24-bit. The resolution is much better than it used to be, I think. Although obviously there are various, what converters you use, bloody blah, all that sort of argument that goes on. But we think we found quite a good sort of way of working where you are encompassing the new technology, but also utilising the old stuff as well.
Is there anything you miss from the pre-Pro Tools days?
I think I quite miss the sort of excitement of recording everything on Analogue, because there was, from a producer point of view now, you don't actually have to make your mind up at any time, because you if you've got a decent Pro Tools setup, you never run out of tracks, basically. And in the old days, there was a kind of, you have to make your mind up, because there's only, if you only had 24 tracks or latterly 48 tracks or whatever, although some people used to hook up two 48 track Sony digitals or whatever, but I never did that. And I still try, even though we've got Pro Tools, I still try never to have more than 48 tracks when I sit down and mix, which I think is quite a good thing. And the other thing I miss is although if you asked me to go back to it, I'd say no, but was mixing without computers,
Right.
which was very much more a kind of full-on experience where you would have everybody and their dog helping you, do it. So I kind of missed that, because now it's like, oh well, we can always come back and do it again, and there's always that in the back of your mind, whereas in the old days it wasn't really like that. And there would be probably a lot more, quite often more excitement in the music too. Funnily enough, I'm getting back into trying, everybody's used metronome clicks for a long time now, and of course a lot of dance music relies on that, that's fine, but with kind of pop music or rock music that I do, it's really nice if you're working with great musicians, which generally I am, that to not have to rely on that. I mean, in some ways, when we do stuff with click, it's great, because it means you can take a bit of vocal from here and move it to there without, just literally cut and pasting. But nowadays, we've done last few sessions that I've done with Giles, we've done with Jay, without click, and we've wanted to move something. Jay's managed to do it just by stretching it or doing whatever. So, I'm sort of trying to go back to more old school. It's nice if it speeds up a bit in the chorus, perhaps, or whatever.
Yeah. Do you mix to analog tape still? Do you go to half inch?
Try to go to half inch, yes. We did a 5.1 mix recently, so obviously you can't do that. Right. So I tend to, we mix to half inch. Time code DAT, that seems rather old fashioned, but as a sort of safety thing, I suppose, and then usually back into Pro Tools at 96K,
Right.
24-bit. So yeah, 3 different formats.
Yeah. So do you still mic things up the same way as you always did? Where do you start? What do you start
Well,
with?
yeah, I mean, I think, obviously if one's experimenting things, you might want to stick a mic up the singer's armpit or something like that to see if you're going to get a different sound. But I mean, otherwise, it's pretty sort of, I was taught when I say taught, when I worked in the commercial studios when I was young, namely Advision and Lansdowne Studios. There's fairly sort of set ways of miking things, orchestras or a flute or a clarinet that are what they are because time has told you that's the best way to mic that instrument up. Yeah. So yes, and I mean drums and things. There's well, I'm always trying different mics on different things and all that. But yeah, so I mean, one experiments as much as one can. I mean, there's another great thing about having one's own studio here is that you're not necessarily under the same time constraints.
Sure.
And I think, you know, very much in the last few years, if you're at a commercial studio that's costing a lot of money per day, and we all know that budgets have gone down, you don't have time to experiment the same. You know, I remember working with Peter Gabriel in the early 80s, and, you know, to spend a day or two just miking up a electric kettle or something, because, you know, we were boiling the kettle and wanted to, you know, hear the sounds. I mean, you'd think nothing of spending 2 days miking up an electric kettle, whereas now, you know, 5 minutes would be, you know, your limit.
You've probably spent a couple of days searching through sample libraries for one.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
That'd be Jay's job.
Yeah. So, well, as you know, with your, you know, having your own studio now as well, it does give you a wonderful freedom.
What are your attitudes about someone else mixing your stuff? Does that happen often?
Well, it doesn't happen massively often. Although saying that, just yesterday I think we sent off a Pro Tools file to America for someone to mix a McFly record, because they're going to make the best of two McFly albums into one for release in America, and if they think that having X's name on it is going to sell more records because X is the the equivalent of Spike Stent here, then that's fine. You know, I'm old enough to not be to throw my toys out of the pram about it, because I know that I can mix as well as anybody really at the end of the day. Although saying that, you know, there is something to be said about if you've been working on a record for months on end, having somebody else look at it objectively. But historically I've tended to mix my own stuff, and you know, had a reasonable amount of success. So, you know, I guess I must be able to do it to some extent. But no, you know, if everything I did now was taken away to be mixed by somebody else, then I'd probably get a bit shirty. But
what do you get shirty about in the modern recording process? What annoys you?
Record companies. Otherwise, I think, in a way, I've sort of got, just through doing it for so long, you get a bit more kind of laid back about it, able to handle sort of difficult situations better. I remember when I started producing, I found it quite hard to do the engineering side of it as well, because I've always been very sort of a bit of a stickler for tape levels, line up of machines, this, that, and the other. Because I think if you're very, very careful on every aspect along the line, there's less chance of things going wrong. You know, there's a whole generation of people that's come up who've never known analog and don't understand what azimuth is, or, you know, tweaking your top end on particular sort of tape and all that sort of thing. So, I mean, in some ways, Pro Tools, you just plug it in and that's it. You don't ever have to sort of do a frequency response test on it. So, but anyway, going back to your question, the only thing that really annoys me is the fact that as many records are being sold now as ever, and the budgets are smaller, and therefore it doesn't take the brain of Britain to work out that some people are making more money, and the people who actually provide the content, which is the bands and us who make it, seem to be losing out, and I think that's grossly unfair. I think most record companies now are big corporations that having to satisfy their shareholders, and therefore their quarterly reports are more important than the music.
That's the nature of business, I suppose, as it becomes a more professional industry.
Yeah, I mean, when I started, bands would get signed because the A&R guy liked the band. We wouldn't talk about singles necessarily or anything like that. You go in the studio and make a record. And when you finished it, they go, well, that track might be good as a single. Whereas now it's all just so commercially driven I mean, I guess so are many other aspects of life outside of the music business. Music business is just one.
Absolutely. It's the modern world.
It's the modern world.
Yeah.
So I don't want to sound like an old fogey, but I think I don't think music is any better now than it was 30 years ago, from technology or whatever.
Stepping back to 30 years ago, what prompted you to get into the business in the first place? I mean, your early career is fairly well documented that you went through Advision and Lansdowne, but what prompted you to actually apply for the job in the first place?
When I saw a picture of a studio in a magazine, it was a magazine, it was called Beat Instrumental at the time, and it was a sort of, half the magazine was about bands, and the other half, the back end of the magazine was about studios, and I saw a picture of a studio in it one day, and I thought, wow, that looks cool, because I love music. I love band, but I realised I played in bands at school, but I realised I wasn't very good, or not as good as I wished I could be. And I just, when Led Zeppelin's first album came out, that was it for me. That was just, I realised I could never be like them in a band. Mind you, most bands aren't either. But the music moved me so much, and I thought, well, if I can be involved in making music, and I was quite good at sort of science subjects at school, so I took maths and physics A level and stuff. So the amalgamation of, or the juxtaposition, I suppose, of music and the technology just equaled this, really. Totally obvious, really, wasn't it?
I bet no careers advisor suggested it.
No, they certainly didn't. No. The nearest my career advisor got to it is he thought that I could join the BBC and become a newsreader. No, it actually wasn't that far away. And that was mainly because I was always conned into reading the lesson in chapel. I went to boarding school where we had to go to church every other day, and so anyway, so I got the opportunity to go and see a studio, which was funnily enough a home studio, but was quite sophisticated at the time, because we're talking about 1971 or something here. And it was a guy called John Congus who was a guy who had two big hits in the early 70s, and he had his own studio in a basement in Barnes. And I went to look at it through various friends who had a connection, and I just thought, that's it, that's what I wanted to do. And from then on, that would have been my A-level year, so I just sort of managed to get through that year, but wrote to all the studios. And I was at school in Oxford, and the Manor Studios existed at the time just down the road, and it was about, I don't know, 7 or 8 miles away, and I got on my bike and went over there and asked for a job, then not realising really that, I guess, Tubular Bells has only just been made there and stuff, and ultimately ended up becoming an employee of Virgin in the late 70s as well, so it was quite fun.
So did you get the job at the Manor?
No, I didn't get the job at the Manor. There weren't any jobs going, but I think they were. I was quite good at sort of just. I was determined to get a job. There was never any question of not getting one. Which I would say is good advice to anybody who really wants to do something.
It's the advantage of a good education.
Well, I don't know about that, but I just sort of wrote. Well, there were only about a dozen studios in England then that were any good, I suppose.
Yeah, and you aimed high.
So I just wrote to all of those, and eventually got taken on at Advision, which at the time, was a top studio. Well, it doesn't exist anymore.
So that drum sound. Is that an irritation to you? Everyone talks about that all the time.
Good God, no. No, it's no, it's great to be sort of known for something in that sense, I suppose. The only thing is you can't hope to get that or do that. It doesn't work on everything. I mean, at one point in the mid-'80s or whenever it was, people wanted me to get that drum sound on anything, you know. Yeah. And of course it didn't always work. And I, you know, now I love dry drum sounds. I like big drum sounds. Just depends on what you're doing. You know?
But it was the gated thing, wasn't it?
It was the gated thing. I mean, that the whole thing came through this the famous listen mic on the SSL console, and it's so hard to look back now and realise what a huge leap forward the SSL console was, because no console ever before had a limiter and a compressor and a noise gate on every channel. No. I mean, you were lucky if you had 4 noise gates, which were Keypexes in those days, and you had obviously you had compressors and things. Yeah. But there certainly wouldn't have been, you know, if you had a 32-track console or something, which I think was what our first SSL console was. You certainly didn't have 32 compressors or noise gates around. So to be able to just stick one in on a button like that, because in other words, everything before was sort of very premeditated. You had to ask the tape op, you know, to go and patch one in, and this, that, and the other. And I mean, the drum sound really came through this listen mic button, because no console had ever had that before as well. You obviously had talkback one way to the headphones, but if you wanted to listen to them in the studio, you had to plug a mic in and bring it up a channel on the console. So that was you know, the great idea. And the SSL had put this massive compressor on it, because the idea was to hang one mic in the middle of the studio and hear somebody talking the other side. And it just so happened that we turned it on one day when Phil was playing his drums. Right. And we thought that was good. And then I had the idea of feeding that back into the console. Yeah. And then putting the noise gate on, so when he stopped playing, it sucked, you know, the big sound of the room into nothing.
And that was the gate on the channel that you used?
That was the gate on the channel, yeah. You see, and it was just so easy just to go doink, doink like that, rather than go over here, patch it in, then go over here and fiddle, you know, with it and stuff. So that you know, it was just such a huge thing. You know, we loved the SSL console just immediately, and we, you know, because we at the townhouse, which was where we bought this thing, the budget was that Studio One would have a big console in it, which had a Helios, which the Manor had before, which was kind of up there with, you know, the Neves and the Tridents in terms of it being a sort of very much a handmade, bespoke desk. And then we knew we wanted to do another studio, but it was having to be much cheaper. So Studio One was state of the art, and Studio Two was going to be sort of not semi-pro but cheaper. And at that point, you know, there had been this new lot of inline consoles come along from America, basically, i.e. MCI and Harrison. And Quad 8 was the third one. So the sort of 3 main makes. And then because of the Manor, its proximity to Oxford, they knew of Colin Sanders, who'd started SSL off and had his own studio in a little sort of, well, slightly bit more than a garden shed sort of thing in this village called Stonesfield. So we went up to see the console, and it was inline, because the whole thing of inline was it was more modular and therefore cheaper and so on. And so we looked at this console and thought it looked good, even though the MCIs were getting quite popular and all that. And we just thought, well, you know, let's buy British. You know.
Was that a B series then?
It was, yes, and it had the routing on these little
routing ones,
2 routing knobs here.
One,
yeah. And so we were the first sort of commercial studio to get one of those. And it quite soon morphed into the E, I suppose. Yeah.
And essentially, you've bought one that's almost identical.
Yeah.
Even 25 years later.
I know. Yeah.
Is that?
It's kind of like, how could they improve?
Yeah.
On it. I mean, without being, what's the word, critical or whatever. I've had a long affiliation with SSL, and Colin, became a good friend of mine, and so, and through the B series and the early E, we all helped develop the automation system with it as well. So of course I'm biased towards it. And a lot of the guys who were the maintenance guys at the townhouse at the time all ended up working at SSL, and Chris, good old friend, still does.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the other day I was mixing 5.1 on another well-known manufacturer of consoles, and it has about 14,000 more knobs on it, and I can't work out that it does anything more than this. I just think this is a classic design. It's almost like certain things, like kind of the internal combustion engine, for want of a better analogy, that they can't really improve on how it is, and I think that's actually, it's not that good an analogy, because they do keep improving on it by making it more fuel efficient or whatever. But ergonomically, I think these consoles are brilliant, because they can do virtually anything, and yet I mean, obviously it looks impressive to somebody who's never seen one before, but if you look at some consoles, there's so many buttons and so many knobs, and you can make mistakes by leaving buttons in because you can't see them because they're being hidden by another knob or something. So I'm very pleased with these consoles, and I like the sound of them. Some people, I mean, the whole thing with sound is it's such a sort of subjective thing, isn't it, really? Some people hate SSLs, some people love them. I remember Gus Dudgeon saying to me once, many years ago, that you couldn't make a hit on an SSL. It's like, okay, well, if you think that, then that's fine,
Do you use all the automation still, even though you've got the Pro Tools sitting there?
Yes, I do use the automation. I try and use Pro Tools as, when it comes to mixing, as just like a tape machine in a way. Saying that, sometimes if there are moves that you really feel that are so tight that with the resolution of these faders and the time code and so on, then maybe we'll make the odd move in Pro Tools. But I mean, that comes down to the why does a dog lick its balls syndrome. The answer, because it can. And of course, in the old days, the finickiness that we now do because you can, you just wouldn't have bothered with. Your brain wouldn't have had, I don't think our brains had that amount of fine-tuningness 20, 30 years ago. And I think records, in a way, nowadays are very finely tuned, and even if a singer can sing, the likelihood is that it will have been lightly dusted with auto-tune, I would imagine. I don't know, I'm not speaking for every other producer, but I get the feeling that sort of happens,
Do you still, in that case, if you're using all the console's features, do you write down all the outboard settings, and like we did in the old days with the total recall? And
well, yeah, you have to, really. If you're going to do a recall, then it's obviously the assistant's worst nightmare job. Because I'm all right, Jack. I don't tend to have to sort of do it. Although obviously now we're here in our own studio, it's a bit more all sort of mucking in together.
Yeah. But you'll do that, and then if need be, dial it all up again and
Yeah, but I tell you what, even though you can see tons of outboard gear here, I don't kind of tend to use an awful lot,
No.
to be honest. And when I do use it, I'll try and do things like anything that hasn't got sort of numbers on it. I'll like input settings on I don't know, Rev 7 or something. I'll try and have exactly at 12 o'clock or something.
Yeah.
So I'll try and make it as easy as possible for everybody.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, this is the thing with, you know, the Pro Tools people will say, well, you don't have to do any of that, you know. But ultimately, things like when they had the auction when Whitfield Street closed down the other day, you know, everybody wanted the 1176s, everybody wanted the old Neve compressors. That old stuff, you know, whoever would have thought a DBX 160 would be valuable? You know what I mean?
The microphones as well.
Yeah,
47s were going for thousands.
Yeah. And I just think there is still if people do like these things. I can't tell if you put a compressor on Pro Tools and someone's using say an 1176 copy and then a I don't know, an LA2 copy or something. I can't tell the difference, whereas analogically I can.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether it's a mental thing in Pro Tools or psychological thing where the interface is just... I mean, saying that, you know, Chris at SSL, they recently did a plug-in of the Listen mic compressor that we were talking about. And, you know, which is pretty good, and it's a freebie as well. Yeah. And we A-B'd the original one to this, and they managed to have sort of got it's sounding pretty good, really. Yeah. I mean, I still find it hard to understand how someone can sit there writing code can do it, you know, but of course, you know, I guess SSL have been doing it for years with you know, various aspects of their digital consoles and so on. But, you know, the other thing which on the newer versions of Pro Tools is better is latency and all that with plugins and this, that and the other. So I think, if I digress, but going back to your original question, you know, I love the tools, but when it comes to mixing, and you've got a lot of analog gear that we have here and an analog console, I try and just strip off everything so it's just working as a tape machine.
Yeah. Should be good. What do you think makes you good at what you do? What's your unique selling point?
Oh, I don't know. I think a lot of it is getting on with people.
Right.
I'd say half of it really is your ability to communicate, to understand what they're on about, and to make them feel at ease and at home in a studio, which is ultimately, you know, to some people can be a threatening sort of environment. Most musicians didn't become musicians to work in a studio. They become musicians to stand on a stage and have thousands of people adulating them, you know. So I think, you know, a lot of the job, obviously knowing the technical side of things as well is important, but a lot of the job is how you get on with people. And I think I'm sort of, you know, quite sort of easygoing, and, you know, you also want to have a good time as well and have a laugh. Not that it's a laugh every minute of the day.
No. You obviously still enjoy doing it, otherwise you wouldn't bother.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to be honest, I when I started in the studio as a T-boy, my parents were a bit sort of miffed, really, because they thought, well, he should sort of go off to university or at the very least join the BBC and get some sort of diploma or something. If you're not, you know, even if you're not going to go to university, get a degree. So I kind of said, look, give me a few years, if you don't mind, and then I will, you know, I kind of quite fancied the idea of being an architect and a couple of sort of things like that, I suppose. Well, you know, luckily I've never had to sort of resort back to that. And so, you know, 2 or 3 years has turned into 33 years or whatever it is now.